So we're back after a bit of a hiatus. We're back with Kabul'd together. There has been this. First, okay, I'm forgetting my routine here. We are your hosts, Kristy Perano and Jonathan Reutenberg. There has been a few developments, but among them is, I think, the one thing I'd love to focus on tonight, which is the Taliban's treatment of women in Afghanistan, and we're getting some indications that things are not going too well on that front.
Yeah, I would say that most of the Taliban assurances about having changed have not come to pass. I think the one thing they have done is probably moderated their behavior a little bit, while they still feel like the international community is paying attention and they still want to get some of that frozen up money. I think they've claimed that they're going to make some. Initially, they just told women like they can't work and stuff like this, and then they've said, well, maybe if it's a really lowly job and in some circumstances they will, but by and large it's just been like women should be at home having kids and cannot work. I did hear that.
I was going to say the chancellor of a university, which is, this chancellor is Taliban aligned, and he said that women can't attend classes there anymore.
Yeah, there were some universities I think that did open with like gender segregated classes. But yeah, it has seemed to be a bit of a case by case basis. Basically initially all the schools closed, and then I think a lot of schools opened to boys, and then basically all of the primary schools were closed to girls. But I did hear of one province where they were saying that they were gonna allow girls to attend school, but that's one out of like however many dozens of provinces. So it's not. So there was some like, oh, look, the Taliban's letting girls go to school, but it's a very small percentage of the population that potentially benefits from that. And yeah, there was at least one university that said they were going to allow women to go to classes if they were gender segregated classes. But I think, yeah, by and large, women have been completely excluded from Afghan society. And there's also a huge humanitarian crisis there. Like winter is coming. A lot of people aren't working, both the fact that women aren't allowed to work, and even a lot of the economy has just been destroyed overnight with the Taliban takeover. And there's a huge number of families that are US or internationally aligned enough that they're in hiding. And so there's a lot of men that, I mean, by Taliban rules, they're a man, well, they could work, but they're also in hiding if they've had some previous affiliation with US or international forces, because they're afraid if they're going to work, they're going to be discovered. They're not safe at home either, but if they just stay at home all the time, they're not going out and meeting people. They could recognize them and figure out where they are. And so then if they really truly are in hiding at home, then they are at risk in terms of the Taliban is doing house to house searches, but that's not going to be every day that they're going to go to every house. Whereas if they're going to work, then they're exposing themselves every single day. It is a huge humanitarian crisis, and it's definitely exacerbated by the fact the Taliban is making it impossible in most cases for women to work. And there are like female supported households that now, what are they going to do? Like, I mean, I'm in touch with families where one, like a female who was an interpreter who's supporting a mother and a sister, or a female doctor who's supporting her family. In some cases, the women, it's like an all female or female supported, and like for an unmarried woman, and in other cases, or like a widow supporting her children. And then in other cases, a female, the wife and mother was the breadwinner, and maybe she was a doctor or a lawyer or something, and she was more of the breadwinner than the husband was, even though there is a husband in the picture. But yeah, I mean, every woman I have contact with in Afghanistan who's some sort of professional, like, wants to get out because they just know that there's no future for them if they're not going to be able to work. And also they could be hunted down and killed just for having worked previously as a professional woman.
And how is the continued evacuation of SIV applicants going? Has it been going, and has it been going well?
It has been going, but slowly. I would not say well, because I would not say that the current rate is adequate to evacuate SIVs before they're likely to be killed or starved to death. So I would not say it's going well. I'm glad that it is going somewhat. I mean, there have been, there's a couple different parallel efforts. There's a kind of more official evacuation through the State Department by a cutter, and those are like charter flights going out of Kabul. It has been, I think, about a couple of weeks. Well, about for 3 weeks, there were almost no planes that left Afghanistan. I think a lot of it was Taliban obstruction, some of it was State Department obstruction, some of it was maybe lack of places to land the planes. Everybody pointed fingers at someone else. You know, it wasn't really clear exactly who was the issue. But some of those issues have been resolved. There's still a lot of like attempts to get together some money and charter a plane, and not having landing rights. There's flights that I got people manifested on over a month ago that are still stuck because they haven't been able to finalize the details of where to land or things like that. So it's not that everybody who can come up with enough money to charter a plane is just good to go, but there are some organizations that are fairly regularly getting some flights out of Kabul. I've actually not known very many people that got on the flights. I mean, I was able to help one green card family get manifested on a flight out of Mazar-e Sharif. There are more opportunities for American citizens and green card holders because they're pretty much eligible for any plane that leaves Afghanistan. It's harder for people that don't have that kind of status, because like even late stage SIVs or people that have visas are not as high a priority. They're starting to get some priority, but for the last, like, most of the evacuation efforts have focused on American citizens and green card holders, and then sort of special sort of groups that were prioritized by whoever was paying for the flights. But yeah, basically we saw 3 weeks of almost zero evacuations, except for some people smuggling people over borders. And now I think the border situation's about the same, except that Uzbekistan started offering transit visas. So like if you had a visa to another country, they've started granting a visa just to pass through Uzbekistan and get on a plane. But pretty much borders are closed and embassies are closed still. So most of the overland stuff is still kind of sublegal. But I think there are groups that are continuing to get people out through Pakistan or sometimes Tajikistan. And then some of them have gotten them evacuated from the neighboring country. Others are still like sheltering people in those neighboring countries. And then in terms of like flights, there is kind of a steady stream of planes going from Mazar-e Sharif. I think typically maybe one or two a day. And then there's other people that are trying to get planes going that haven't succeeded yet. And then you have a more official State Department run, through Qatar, evacuations out of Kabul. And those had been about 2 a week. And now they seem to have picked up to like 1 or 2 a day, which is good, but still a few hundred people a day is not enough, because I don't even know how many citizens and green card holders are left. The State Department kept saying it was about 100 citizens, and then they announced like over 150 that had been evacuated, and then they stopped talking about it, I think, because it sort of undermined their initial data as being way too optimistic. So now they don't even talk about how many green card holders and citizens are left, and probably maybe because they know it's embarrassingly high. But also I think there's been enough of them gotten out that we're starting to see opportunities for visa holders to get on some of the more official evacuations, which is good. But I'm just concerned that the rate is not nearly fast enough. And it's also really not clear how far down the list State Department intends to go. I mean, you get a lot of still rhetoric from them about how like, oh, we haven't abandoned Afghanistan. We still care about our allies. We're working hard to save them. But still like zero concrete statements about like we're going to evacuate everybody that's reached at least this stage in the SIV process or something like that. We still have like zero information on that. It's still all happy talk, like almost 2 months after the Taliban took over Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's good that the administration's not talking about it, because Biden's approval ratings, I think, have been on the up and up as of late. From after that big like plateau, that big valley what am I trying to say? The big dip that occurred in September right after the pullout. It's coming back up again, and probably not a moment too soon for Democrats in Virginia. So I mean, is this just fading from the news, the whole Afghanistan debacle, or I guess like other issues like taking center stage, or was the or like what's going on? Like, is the Biden administration recovering from this?
I think it's still a little early to say. Yeah, I mean, I think there is less interest in the news, but there is still more news on it than there had been like prior to. I mean, for the last 4 years, like during the Trump administration, you would see very few stories on like Afghan interpreters or things like that. And it was really hard to convince reporters to write about that kind of issue. And I have seen more stories. I mean, the sort of like new normal for the amount of talking about Afghanistan, I mean, I still think is obviously lower than it was in August. And I mean, I would say it's too low from the perspective of someone that, you know, that's kind of been like my number one advocacy issue for a long time. But it's still higher than it had been like prior to the Afghanistan withdrawal. And sometimes there is an ebb and flow to it. So, I mean, like there was a lot of outlets that had the story of this interpreter who helped save Biden's life, like in 2008, and State Department left him behind. And then one of these private evacuation groups helped get him out through Pakistan. And then I think he's in the US or on his way to the US now. I think this private group gone to Pakistan, and then the State Department like did something, you know, gave his family permission to join to go to Qatar and join the military base or something. I don't know the details, but I saw several news organizations that had the story of, you know, how this interpreter had been saved. And of course, the State Department said this is an example of their unfailing dedication to Afghan allies, even though it basically relied on a private group to locate this guy and extract him from Afghanistan. So I don't think it really, you know, entitles the Biden administration to victory laps on that one. Yeah, I mean, they probably have the strategy of continuing to claim that they evacuated enough people and that everything's fine. But I do think that there's been a realization that even if not now, if they don't continue to try to get SIVs out, it could really come back to bite them in the future. Because yeah, people could forget about Afghanistan for a while if we're, you know, back to school and you know, we have other, and we've got COVID, you know, for the last year and a half, and we've got other things to talk about. People could forget about Afghanistan, but that doesn't mean that it isn't going to come back to haunt the Democrats when you have like all these well-documented stories of veterans who tried really hard to save their interpreters who ended up getting beheaded because the Biden administration, because the interpreter survived for 3 or 4 months and he still didn't get evacuated and then he got beheaded. Like that's still going to look bad for the Biden administration, even if not in that moment. It would make great campaign fodder for Republicans in the future. Even though, I mean, I do not really have confidence that if Trump were president, the situation would be very much different. But still, if you're president and you do it, you're responsible for it. So on the one hand, a lot of Republicans are criticizing Biden for doing exactly what they praised Trump for a year or two ago. But on the other hand, the Biden administration is the one that implemented this disastrous policy. And yeah, I think they're trying to change the subject, but I also think that there is a realization that even if people lose interest in Afghanistan for a while, if they really just walk away from tens of thousands of people and let them just get murdered by the Taliban, then that could come back to haunt them in the future. And you would hope that these people would have like actual consciences that this is morally wrong. This is bad for national security as well. I mean, but I guess it's hard to know exactly. Sometimes people in power seem to be rather devoid of normal human emotion, and you know, I won't speculate on which people do and don't actually care. I would hope some do, but I wouldn't be that confident that, you know, that the people really making the decisions are doing it for moral reasons as opposed to political aesthetics. But I guess we can hope that they actually do care, at least a few of them.
Yeah, this is old news, obviously, but the Panjshir resistance appears to have fallen. They were the last part of the Afghanistan and the Panjshir Valley that Taliban in control. They now control it. And so, what went wrong, and is there any hope of a possible resistance movements in the future?
Well, I think that there's a lot of like claims and counterclaims on what's going on in Panjshir, and I think there's a lot of propaganda on both sides. It may very well be that the Taliban controls the area, but I think also maybe a bit of a guerrilla warfare situation where they're continuing to, where there's like fight. Maybe the Taliban kind of controlled it, but there's also still kind of guerrilla warfare from the National Resistance Front. But I think there was just a huge lack of international support for that, and there's only so long that they can keep going in a landlocked situation. And it was kind of like the world was like, well, let's just let the Taliban take over, and like, well, Afghans really should fight for their country, and then some of them wanted to, and then they're like, oh, but but we can't. Oh, but it's already gone. We can't do anything. I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a little hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. I mean, there's a lot, even amongst Afghans that you talk to, like some of them will say, well, unless the US or some equivalent power goes back into Afghanistan, there's no way to get rid of the Taliban. But then others say that, well, the Taliban doesn't, it's like a few thousand Taliban can't really maintain control of a country of like 35 million people, especially if they can't figure out how to provide basic necessities. Like if people believe they're just going to starve to death anyway, then all of a sudden they don't really have any motivation to not fight the Taliban. So I think it really kind of remains to be seen. I'm not super optimistic about national resistance toppling the Taliban. I would tend to think that what's going to end up happening is the Taliban is going to maintain control for a few years. They're going to break all their promises about not hosting Al-Qaeda and actually fighting ISIS. And then there's going to be another major scale terrorist attack in the US or Europe in the coming year or two or 3 or 4. And then the world's going to say, oh, maybe letting terrorists have their own country in Afghanistan isn't working so well after all. Let's go get rid of the Taliban again. I mean, that's my personal view on like what's going to happen.
And repeat.
Yeah. It basically just a 25-year cycle where you let the Taliban run Afghanistan for 5 years. The Taliban works with Al-Qaeda, which we know they've done all along, which they never did anything except lie to us about not doing. And basically the Taliban has broken every single thing they agreed to, except for not attacking Western countries, which is the only thing that they promised that they don't yet have the resources to break their promise. So I'm not optimistic about the Taliban, actually doing anything to maintain ISIS or to break ties with Al-Qaeda. Like if they were going to do that, they would have, like now they're in power. So, why would they cooperate with what we want them to do? I mean, there are other people that do think that the Taliban has enough economic issues and enough ISIS issues that they will be motivated to cooperate more with Western powers. I mean, I do certainly think it's good that the Taliban is definitely doing revenge killing, but they're claiming they're not, which means they're having to keep it on the down low, which means that the number of people being killed is less than it would be if they were being really open about it. And also, I have been kind of pleasantly surprised that the Taliban has been able to be just bought off on evacuation flights and stuff, because I was not convinced, like when, on August 31st, I wouldn't have guessed that we were going to have as many flights out of Taliban controlled territory as we have had. So I think there are some ways in which, so I guess I have been surprised that the Taliban has been as willing to engage with the international community as it has, but the problem with celebrating that is they're basically just talking to the US and getting some money from the US and then doing a bunch of stuff they said they weren't. So, that doesn't make it like a good working relationship. It's not like we've really seen hugely different behavior from the Taliban. There is, though, a school of thought that the Taliban has sort of learned from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other Middle Eastern human rights abusers how to be bad, but not so bad that the world decides they can't tolerate you. There was some hope that when they reopened passports, like in the last week or two, they were going to actually act like a government and give people a passport that applied for it. But there have been like multiple reports of people being disappeared who were like targeted people that went to get passports. So obviously the Taliban decided that they're not going to abide by any sort of international standards about not disappearing people when they see government services. So they're not trying too hard to act like a legitimate government if they're still willing to just murder their own people when they show up to ask for a passport.
Well, as you can see through my bad camera, the Atlanta heat is sort of getting to me. So we might wrap it up with this question. Definitely want to circle back, talk about Taliban's treatment of women, because, I mean, has the fact that the U.S., and allies, control of Afghanistan, they've given the women like a taste of freedom almost. They're not going to easily forget that, right? And is that going to make it harder for the Taliban in the long term to keep, quote unquote, keep women in their place, and maybe we could see more of a spark for a fight for freedom among the women in Afghanistan if the Taliban go too far?
I mean, I would hope so. I guess I don't know. In order for there to be some sort of a like female-led resistance that goes beyond protesting, there would have to be some way for these women to like obtain weapons and military training and things like that. Yeah, I do definitely think that Afghan women, having had freedom and education for 20 years, and also the literacy rate went from 10% to 50% in Afghanistan. So you now have, millions of have like 35 million Afghans, about half of which actually do know how to read and write. And also, I think, possibly even just due to economic considerations, the Taliban has not totally shut off internet in Afghanistan. So now you have people that are educated and have had a taste of and have enjoyed having freedom for 20 years and are literate and can read about what's going on in the rest of the world. So yes, I mean, we can certainly hope that it's more difficult to like control and suppress that population, but I think it's still a little too early to tell. And it also depends on whether the international community takes any meaningful steps to actually pressure the Taliban on these types of things, or whether they just pay lip service to, yeah, we really value women's rights and we're really disappointed that the Taliban, marries off child brides and they really should stop doing this. But like without, international condemnation isn't necessarily going to lead to meaningful changes. So yeah, I hope so, but I guess I feel like it's a little too early to say like really how is that going to go and how much of a resistance can women put up to actually change their status in Afghanistan.
Well, we can only hope for the best. We'll, as we always, will keep an eye on it. You can follow me on Twitter at Overlord Johnny. Kristy, you want to tell them where they can follow you?
Yeah, my handle is at Kristy Perano. Kristy spelled Kristy, and then Perano Perano.
Yeah, we'll have it in the description for the video as well. Kristy, as always, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you either next week or later.
Yeah, thanks for having me.